In terms of the results, we've got now the sounds from, or the stimuli from all these different sounds, the marimba, the piano, and the French horn. But now on the y-axis, rather than the duration ratings, we have too many things, so I just did some subtraction. I subtracted the rating of a note when it was paired with the short gesture from the rating of that same note when it's paired with the long gesture. So now what we're going to see is just the difference, which is how much visual information changed your perception of the note's duration. We find again with the marimba sound, you get a big difference. Marimba sound was rated a lot longer when paired with the long gesture than when it was paired with the short gesture. It's just a replication of the first experiment. With the piano sound, you got a smaller effect, but still something. So the piano sounded longer when it's paired with that long gesture. The really crucial question here is what happens with the French horn, the clarinet, and the voice, and the white noise. These things can't be caused by an impact gesture. And as it turns out, it's really a beautiful data here. We have no meaningful influence on those sounds. So because the whiskers now cross the 0 bar, we can say that it's not meaningfully different from 0. And the other way of looking at this is that I'm asking people to ignore visual information when making their duration judgments. Turns out it's very easy to do this when the gesture couldn't have caused the sound. When it's clear that the gesture did, you can't ignore it. People are trying to, but they're not able to. And that's because your brain is actually quite brilliant at finding the sights and the sounds that go together. It can tell this kind of thing causes an impact sound, but not a sound like la, or the sound from the clarinet. So it shows that the gesture is not just changing the way sort of you think you hear the sound, but it actually changes your perception of the note. That note, if it were acoustically longer on the marimba, it wouldn't sound any different than if it's acoustically the same and the gesture changes your perception of it. And so this got me thinking about, well, how much does visual information actually play a role in music? I mean, is this really an important thing? And so last year I did or 2 years ago, it was 2008, I did a review paper looking at all the research on how visual information can play a role in music. And here's what I found. I found about 25 or 20 different ways in which visual information can change what you're hearing. So you don't have to worry about reading all these, but let me just go down the list. We know vision can change your perception of timbre, loudness, pitch accuracy, the size of musical intervals, judgments of dissonance, tension, affect in music, valence, performance quality. The list goes on and on. Pretty much anything that's important in music can actually, the perception can actually be affected by visual information. And so this shows that vision's influence is really very widespread. And it raises some interesting and perhaps troubling questions about what music is. Is music this acoustic thing, and our perception of it is just sort of biased by visual information? In which case, the acoustics is sort of the true music, and our perception is messed up by visual information. Or is the visual information actually an essential part of the musical experience? In which case, taking it out robs the performer and the audience of certain amounts of musical communication. The sort of blunt answer is that whether you like it or not, this is how the mind works. Our brains wire together auditory and visual information and have been doing so for millions of years, long before we ever created music. So as long as there has been music to experience, visual information has been playing a role in the musical experience. But there's actually sort of a more subtle way of looking at this, and this is that our perceptual system and all the biases and quirks and weird things about the way perception works is actually a baked-in, fundamental part of what music is. And so, one more thing. So this has actually gotten a lot of research, media interest recently, and so the past 2 days they did 2 different television interviews looking at how this idea of how visual information can play a role in music. And so I'll put them up on my website when I get them. I haven't actually received them yet. But yeah, this is an idea that's really catching on in the media because it seems somewhat counterintuitive that visual information plays a role in the musical experience. And this raises this philosophical question about, well, where does music exist? So we're going to go back to my favorite scary bald-headed guy now. And I'm going to have to play around and find the right sound file. But what I'm going to do is play an example of a pure tone, a very simple sound, that's high in pitch and low in pitch. This is not a trick question. I just want you to tell me which one sounds louder. Okay, that's a little distorted. Let's try this one. what should have happened is the high-pitched one sounds piercingly loud and the low-pitched one sounds very soft. I promise you, if we run this in a lab, that's what will happen. So you have equal amounts of energy at each frequency, but the high-pitched one sounds a lot louder. Why would the notes with the same intensity sound louder? What's that?
Higher frequency.
So what about the higher frequency? It's the same amount of energy. The frequency, it moves at a faster rate, but that's not, it doesn't play a role here. The reason has nothing to do with the sound. It's with your ears. The shape of your ear canal, the way the brain fires, we're more sensitive to high frequencies. This is why, like piccolos project across a band much better than a really low tuba or something. Sorry. So, and we'll talk about, this is why in an orchestra, you have like 10 cellos, but never 10 piccolos, because no offense, that would be a bad idea. That really cuts through. But the reason it, quote, cuts through has nothing to do with the acoustics. It's all about the way our brain works. And if we heard different frequency ranges differently, orchestras would probably be set up differently. But I have a slight detour here, just to show that as an interesting side note, our perception to high and low frequencies isn't 100% stable across the lifespan. Has anyone heard of something called mosquito team repellent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Have you ever been subjected to it?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. To some people. So, there's this product called mosquito team repellent that can be used to repel teenagers away from shops. There was a problem at one point with kids sort of loitering outside the stores. The shopkeepers wanted to keep the people who weren't buying things away, but let the people with money, the older people, come into the store. And so he had studied perception, and he understood how the hearing system changes across the lifespan. So I've got an example here of mosquito team repellent. Raise your hand. One more time. There's something that's quite present there.
You can't hear it anymore either.
Okay.
Raise your hand if you don't hear that. Okay. Notice a slight age distinction here. Now, it's about around your late 20s, early 30s, we start to lose high frequency hearing. I can personally attest to the way this works. First time I used this illusion in a class I taught several years ago, I was like, oh my God, this is awful, I got to turn it off. And I taught it 2 summers ago in a course, and I thought the sound file wasn't playing. I'm like, I keep hitting it. I'm checking the cables, and I look out, and the students are like, oh! So it's definitely in your late 20s, early 30s that this starts to go downhill. But anyway, that's sort of a little aside. Back to the research. So even though we lose some of our sensitivity to high frequencies as we age, we're always more sensitive on average to high pitches rather than low pitches. And so what this means is that our perception, again, is not a one-to-one correspondence with the external world. 2 sounds can have the same amount of energy. We're going to hear the higher pitched one is louder. So that means our hearing system isn't flat. It's sort of distorted a little. It's tweaked from the way the world is. And in fact, if we were inside the brain of a cat, they would have a different hearing profile, or a pigeon. Different animals are getting different experiences from the same acoustic signal. And this is, I think, crucial in understanding what music is. Because if our perception of sound is not really aligned necessarily with what's in the world, well, what does this mean for things that sound perfectly balanced? If it sounds balanced in your mind, it's all out of balance in the world. There's extra energy on the low end because that's what we need to get sort of inverted by the hearing process so that our experience is that it's balanced. So when Mr. Holder's working with the band and trying to get the tubas down here and bringing the piccolos down and the clarinets out, what we're doing is really messing up the acoustic balance. But we're getting it right for human beings, which is important because that's really what matters for music, is the perception and the mind of the listener. And this is why if you look at an orchestra, you'll find often 10 cellos and 10 basses, but never 10 piccolos or E-flat clarinets. 1 is often enough for the E-flat clarinet. And it's not because it's producing more energy necessarily than other instruments. It's just that we're more sensitive to that high-pitched energy that it's producing. Because in the end, what we care about is not the acoustic information. It's the perception of that information that defines the musical experience.